members. Well, good to see you all today. Good to see you all. We are in the midst of looking at scriptures about the resurrection. And last week, we looked at stuff that was not gospels. So since the gospels were the last thing in the New Testament to be written, with the exception of the book of Revelation, and maybe, well, most of the gospels, most of the epistles are written before the gospels. Maybe one or two epistles or three were written, at the same time as some of the gospels. But we looked at the stuff before the gospels were written, more or less. Certainly the epistles I looked at, 1 Corinthians and Romans, predated the writing down of the gospels. We also looked at Old Testament texts too, and I also talked about, I think this surprised some people, the fact that resurrection was not on the radar screen for the early Jewish people. That was something that developed with them. Remember, Jesus said, on the night before he died, in John's Gospel, I can't reveal everything to you. You can't handle the truth. You can't handle all of it, at least. The Holy Spirit will keep informing you. Now, I think we have a similar thing with the idea of resurrection, that was not the original deposit that the Jewish people received. That was something that gradually was revealed to them. I'll say more. Actually, it inspired me got lessons about Abraham all summer long. Abraham and his family, Jacob and Joseph and all that, all summer long. And so I'm going to focus in on those stories this summer because, what is Abraham's possible motivation if he doesn't believe in the resurrection for following God to a new land? And there are some motivations. One, to be faithful to God. Two, he will find some immortality through his descendants, and that's certainly the way they thought. If your kids live, and from a genetic standpoint too, biologically, that's also how we move forward in life, by passing down our genes, by having our descendants survive and thrive. I think there's more to life than that, but that's certainly a part of life. But we'll come back to that this summer, so we'll touch on that. But today, let me one more thing. So by the time of about 150, 200 years before Jesus, resurrection was a pretty strong idea for the Jewish people. Looked at the Maccabean statements, the Maccabean martyrs. Basically, you can kill me, but it won't matter. All you can do is kill this body. God will raise it up. You can take chunks of me. You can take these pieces, parts. It doesn't matter. God will give me new stuff. So by hundreds BC, so a couple hundred years before Jesus, 150, 200 years before Jesus, this was very strong in most of the Jewish mentality. The Sadducees were a minority group that said, nah, no resurrection. Moses didn't mention it, so therefore it didn't happen, or it won't happen, or it doesn't happen. But I did mention also last week that the resurrection, though, for the Jewish people was something that happened at the end of time, that God would intervene, everything would be changed and lifted to a new level. But the distinctive thing about Christianity is not that there was resurrection, because the Jews believe that, but that the resurrection didn't happen at the end of time, but happened in the middle of history with Jesus's resurrection. And Jesus is the first fruits, as Paul says, of the harvest that will come later. All right, so we did all that, talked about that kind of stuff. And today I want to start talking about the resurrection in the gospel accounts. When we talk about the crucifixion, I put this diagram up there, a reminder for those of you who were here, and maybe new info for those who weren't. As best we can tell, Mark is the oldest of the Gospels, the first to be written, probably in the late 60s, maybe in the 70s, somewhere in that era. Matthew and Luke were about a decade later, in the 80s AD, and John is off by himself. He doesn't line up as much with Matthew, Mark, and Luke on a lot of things. He's got his own agenda, and there's a lot of his own sources too. There is agreement on some things, but John has independent stuff that he also shares with us. But Mark certainly was influential on Matthew and Luke. It looks like Matthew and Luke each had a copy of Mark. And so as the hypothesis goes, and we haven't dug up these documents, but hypothetically, what scholars have thought for about a century now, this is pretty well trodden now, is that Matthew and Luke each had a copy of Mark, and that they also drew on their own special sources that were independent of Mark and different from each other. But Matthew and Luke also had a common pool of something else, stuff that was non-Mark, and yet that they both put in their Gospels. And some of it they have almost verbatim. But they didn't, they could have gotten it from each other, but most folks don't think that happened. They probably got it from somewhere else. And that mystery source is just simply labeled Q, which in German is source. I think of it as question mark. It's just the questionable question mark mystery source. One day we may dig up a copy of Q. It may have just been something oral that was passed along, so there may not be a copy anywhere. But who knows? We dug up Dead Sea Scrolls. We dug up Nag Hammadi scrolls in the 20th century, and they gave us all kinds of new stuff. So maybe one day, maybe there's a copy sitting in some dusty library in some monastery, buried so deep they haven't discovered it yet. That happens occasionally too. They find these new things. But anyway, so Mark is our oldest source. So when we go to the Gospels, Mark gets primacy of place because we want to look at what he says first, because that's the most bedrock layer of what's written down. Of course, these stories were passed along for a few decades before they started getting written down. If you remember in church history, why did they start writing them down in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s and not 2 years after Jesus died? Well, they didn't feel the need, apparently. Jesus is coming back soon, they were hoping. We don't need to write this stuff down. We can go out, we're still here. We can go out and tell you. But as persecution started, as in the 60s, Peter and Paul and some other of the original apostles started getting knocked off. And as that trend continued, it looked like the early church said, whoa, we're losing the original layer of witnesses in the 60s, 70s, 80s. We better get this stuff down on paper so we can preserve it for future generations. We don't have this word of mouth stuff that we can rely on. So that seems to be the impetus of the writing of the gospel. So Mark. So let's go to Mark. If you have a Bible, it's chapter 16. And if you look at this little scrawny sheet here, I did this for our look at the Passion narratives in the Gospels. But if you notice the resurrection narratives, they're not huge compared to the Passion narratives. Mark only gives us 8 verses about the resurrection. Matthew only gives us 20. Luke gives us 64 if you combine Luke and Acts, and John gives us 56. Compare that to the hundreds of verses they give us about the Passion. The resurrection seems to be not an afterthought, but something they don't dwell on as much. It's almost as if we don't really have to explain the resurrection. It happened. We just tell you it. We just proclaim it. The Passion takes a little more explaining. Why does a Messiah who gets crucified stay the Messiah? Doesn't that mean he's defeated as Messiah? Well, actually, the resurrection helps explain why, too. Things didn't end with Jesus's death. But it seems the early church had a lot more mental angst and spent a lot more mental energy dealing with the Passion than with the resurrection, because the Jews took resurrection for granted. And some Greek groups Greco-Roman groups were looking forward to some kind of resurrection, some kind of life, though those things were kind of hazy and fuzzy in some ways. All right, so Mark. And when we get to the Gospels, actually, I think I put this on this sheet. I did. In the Gospels, there are basically 3 clusters of traditions that you can lump the various Gospel accounts into. There's a cluster around the empty tomb. There's a cluster around events that happened of Jesus appearing in Jerusalem to Christians. And there's a cluster around Jesus appearing in Galilee. So all 4 Gospels have an empty tomb. And Mark doesn't add anything else, at least not originally. Matthew adds quick appearance in Jerusalem and then some Galilean appearances. You don't get any Galilee in Luke. We'll talk about that in a little bit. You do get Jerusalem and Galilee in John. So there's this cluster. Now, Jesus doesn't appear to show up and stay in any of these accounts. He pops in, he pops back out again. They're quick, I wouldn't say drive-by appearances, but they're not they're not extended appearances. So Jesus is doing something different. He lived and hung out with his apostles in his original earthly body, but in his resurrected body, something has shifted. But empty tomb, Jerusalem, and Galilee are our three clusters we want to kind of keep in mind as we go through this. So let's see what's in Mark and then how Matthew and Luke extend that story and how John extends that story as well. So it starts out when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, which Mary, mother of James? There were several Jameses. Jesus had a brother named James. Is that the Virgin Mary they're talking about? Is that the mother of James and John? Is that the mother of James, the son of Alphaeus? Is that the mother of a whole different James? I mean, James is Jacob, very common Jewish name. There are only about 10 boy names, about 10 girl names that were used in New Testament times anyway, and they recycled them. Use your grandparents' names for your kids, and anyway, your parents' names for your kids. So who the mother of James is, we're not sure, but Mary Magdalene, Mary, mother of James, and someone named Salome brought spices so they might go and anoint him, Jesus. Didn't have time to anoint him in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John, they do bury him with some spices. But the women in Matthew, Mark, and Luke are going to do the final burial rites. A reminder of what Jewish burial was. They didn't put you in the ground and embalm you back then. So the spices are not to embalm and preserve your body. The spices are to kind of be nice to you. They cleaned up your body. They put some anointing on it to kind of act as perfume while the body decayed, so it wouldn't be quite so bad in some ways. And they would do a two-stage burial. They had these shelves, they would lay the body out. And when you dig up tombs, sometimes you have a one-shelf tomb or a two-shelf tomb, or if you're a big family, maybe a 3 or 4 shelf tomb. And they have these things. And they apparently lay the bodies on the shelves. And then they come back in a year later and they scrape the remains, so it's your bones, fragments together, put them in a coffin about this big. They call it an ossuary, a bone box. Earlier Jews didn't do this. Later Jews don't do this, but during New Testament times, this was very common, and you can dig up these tombs all over the place. And they find these tombs. They find these ossuaries. Recently, early 1990s, they found an ossuary marked Caiaphas that they think is Caiaphas the high priest. It was a high-end part of a cemetery, and it was very ornate and had the right names on it. So that's in the museum in Jerusalem, the Israeli National Museum. Caiaphas' bone box. So they lay out on the shelf, and so they're going back in to do the final rites for Jesus before they leave his body for a year. Then they'll come back supposedly a year later and do something else with it. Oh, and then once they put your bones in the bone box, the end of the story is they have little niches then in the wall, and they slide those bone boxes in. And once you put Aunt Mary in the wall, the shelf is ready for Uncle Bob or for whoever is next in your family. And so you have these temporary year-long places to lay the body until you give them their final disposition in the wall, in these niches that you carved into the limestone rock. The rock is very soft, easy to carve around Jerusalem. So that's the way they did it in New Testament times. All right, so they're going there to anoint the body. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, so right at sunrise, they went to the tomb. And they had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" And they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. So this is fairly common in all the Gospels. We've got an open tomb, not a closed tomb. The tomb was closed Friday night, but now on Sunday morning, 36 hours later, it's open for some reason. And the other thing that's common in all the Gospels is that the people that go to the tomb first are women. And for those who do apologetics is not being sorry, being apologizing. Apologetics is defending the faith. Apologists will point out, and rightly so, that women's testimony was no good in a court of law because women were thought to be hysterical, which is a word that comes from women, root word. Their testimony is thought to be unreliable in a court of law. You wouldn't base anything on women's testimony. So if I were going to make things up, if I were going to invent a story that my leader had been crucified, but oh, by the way, he got raised up, the last persons I would want to have involved in the story as witnesses would be women, because everybody would write it off and say, yeah, who listens to a bunch of women? So the fact that all the Gospels agree that women are the first witnesses of the resurrection indicates pretty strongly that this was not something that the early church made up. They would have no benefit or reason to do so. In fact, people would have scoffed. And so the only reason to have women going to the tomb is because women went to the tomb, because they're relating something that happened, not because it's something that is constructed later on. So I think that's very strong evidence of the reliability of these accounts. Now, how many women the Gospels do vary? Who exactly are they? Well, you know, where the angels appear, are they outside the tomb, inside the tomb, one or two angels? There are variations in that, but you do get this cluster of open tomb, women, angelic appearances, and then later Jesus appearances as well. And I've talked about this before. When you deal with eyewitness accounts, and I'm sure this is something anybody that has grand juries trying to do things or other, I'm looking at Trey, witnesses can be tough to deal with sometimes, and human perceptions are not always perfect. And if you get two or three people witnessing the same thing, they might have different spins on it. And so I don't see that as discounting the evidence here. I think that's part of natural human recollection. And also the fact that the church preserves these accounts and says, you know, it's almost as if, you know, guys, this was weird. We really weren't, you know, we really don't understand it, but this is what happened. As best we can tell you, this is what happened. We know it's bizarre. We know it's out of the ordinary. We know people don't rise from the dead. I always love the 20th and 21st century people that say, oh, well, we know that people don't rise from the dead, therefore the resurrection is impossible. Well, guess what? In the first century, they also knew that people don't rise from the dead. That was not a new discovery after the atomic bomb. You know, after we got to the 1940s, we discovered people don't rise from the dead anymore. That was something new in the first century as well. All right, so they get there. Who's going to roll away the stone? Well, they looked up. It's already gone. And this is something that a lot of medieval art misses. In fact, our stained glass window in there follows the medieval pattern because they don't get what was going on in first century Israeli tombs. We've seen enough movies and things, and we've seen children's Sunday school pictures now. But when you look at medieval paintings, and you look at the resurrection in our room, in medieval times, they'd have these large rectangular places they'd put bodies, rectangular stone containers, and a big stone slab that would go on top. You go to medieval cathedrals, and there are a lot of people buried like that. Some of them have carvings of the king or the queen or the knight or whatever on top of the slab that slid over the top. And so when medieval people heard this, they thought the stone's been rolled away. They're thinking of a rectangular tomb on the ground with a flat stone on top that's been slid off. So you see Jesus in our stained glass window, he's coming out of a box, straight up. If you go to museums around the world, you see Jesus popping out of a box. Jack in the Box Jesus, you know, and sometimes flying a flag of resurrection like he's flying in our first window here. So very common medieval theme. That's because they had not invented archaeology and they hadn't dug up any of these tombs. You've seen the pictures of what first century tombs look like, carved into a rock wall, excavated out in a rolling stone of some sort. Sometimes they're rounded rectangles, but usually they're more circular, easy to move. This slides over. Oftentimes there's a groove or a trough carved in below, and the stone can be rolled down. Roll it up, stick a rock in to keep it in place, pull the rock out and let it, you probably wanted to help it roll so it didn't go and shatter, but you know, big rocks. So the women are worried about who's going to roll this thing away, not slide a rectangle off the top, but roll a big ceiling rock from the side of the cliff. Anyway, they get there, already gone, rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side. Now, Luke, Matthew, and John have the young man, or have these people that they talk to being much more supernatural in appearance. So some scholars have said, oh, this is just a regular kid. This is just a young man. Maybe see even that young man from the Passion. In Mark's gospel only, there is a young man that is witnessing Jesus's arrest, and the soldiers make a grab for him. They grab his clothes, and he rips out of his own clothes and runs off naked. Some scholars have said, well, this young man is just a young man like that. Well, it is the same word. Probably not. I don't buy those arguments, but you will encounter those from time to time. So a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, do not be alarmed. This is another thing that makes me think this is more than just some guy. Do not be afraid. There is one class of beings in Scripture over and over again that says things like, do not be afraid. And that is angelic messengers. Because for whatever reason, they're probably pretty intimidating and scary. And so that's another reason for me to not see this as a regular young man, but as some kind of angelic messenger here. Do not be alarmed. So what's the proclamation? What's the kerygma here? It is this. Do not be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who is crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him, shelf. But go, tell his disciples and Peter. Interesting that Peter is singled out. Come back to that in a second. Go tell his disciples and Peter he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. So why is Peter singled out? Well, Peter did do a pretty bad thing by denying Jesus 3 times. But Peter also is the purported leader of the movement. He seems to be the one that gets singled out mostly for leadership. In the early church, he was certainly regarded as one of the leaders as well. So he is separated out. And it's also, it's probably no coincidence either that the early church claimed that Mark was based on Peter's testimony, that Mark was a disciple of Paul and Peter, and then Paul again, and that the Gospel of Mark was thought to be based on Peter's preaching and teaching. Now, whether that's true or not, Mark did hang around Peter, and so it was probably, if the Gospel was written by John Mark, the John Mark of the Bible, then Peter was probably a pretty important guy in his mind. Go tell his disciples and Peter he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you'll see him just as he told you. And so Mark has this wonderful verse. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Mic drop. Walk away. Women go out and say, the end. All right. In some ways, that's not a very satisfying ending. Now, the proclamation has been made, the tomb is empty, and the proclamation from the angelic figure is that Jesus is not here, he's been raised, he's going to appear to you. So, in some sense, Mark has checked some boxes for Easter. He has proclaimed the resurrection here. He's let us know about the events, the women finding the empty tomb, the angelic message that Jesus is not here, he's been raised, and go out and tell his disciples he's going to head them to Galilee. They'll see him there just as he told you. But then Mark stops. There are in your Bible some other endings, shorter endings, longer endings. We'll come back to those after we tackle John. Those were not in the earliest copies of Mark, as best we can tell. Those were added on later. Some of the most early ancient manuscripts don't have these endings. So it is thought they are tacked on later. I could see why you'd want to tack them on later, because this is a fairly unsatisfying ending. If Mark were the only gospel we had, I would not know too much about the resurrection. I'd know something, got the angelic proclamation. I would also know, because I'm part of the early church, they've been talking about the resurrection as long as I've been a Christian. That's something important that's passed down. So maybe they don't need to tell you much. If I am telling a story about John F. Kennedy, and I end with John F. Kennedy getting off a plane in Dallas in November of 1963 and walk away from the story. Well, you all have some resources to fill in what will happen within the hour. Presidential assassination, or Lincoln goes to Ford's Theater, the end. Well, okay, we can connect some dots. And perhaps Mark was assuming that the story was so well known, the proclamation was so out there, he didn't need to say anything more. He wanted to tell about Jesus. He wanted to tell about Jesus' teaching, ministry, proclaim the good news. And Mark is always in a hurry anyway. And so a short ending might not be out of character. Some scholars have suggested that maybe Mark originally wrote more and that original part is lost. That whatever happened, the manuscript got damaged. If you're writing on a scroll, even a book, the last pages of a book are the first to go oftentimes if the book gets damaged. Same thing with a scroll. The end of a scroll is one of the first things damaged. So maybe there's a longer ending that Mark wrote, but we don't have any copies of that we've dug up. All right, so if we just had Mark, I wouldn't be too happy with Easter, but I'd be happy Jesus was raised. I'd be happy that Mark got me the empty tomb, but I would like a little more. And so I don't think it's any accident that when we get to the generation a decade later of Matthew and Luke saying, all right, we need to tell the story too. We're going to take what Mark is saying and extend it. This is one of the places they do want to add more information because this is hardly a satisfying ending. Before we head on to other gospels, any thoughts or comments or questions or brilliant insights?
I guess like the rest would be implied because either the person reading reading it from the scroll or like people telling others through the resurrection would have to have heard it from somebody. So obviously somebody has put it, there was some way that the message got out.
I think so. And I'd remind you of 1 Corinthians 15. We talked about that last week. What does Paul say? I passed on to you as of primary importance, first importance, most important thing. What I in turn had received, implied when I first became a Christian, I passed on as primary importance that Jesus died, he was buried, and he was raised. So for Paul in 1 Corinthians, the most important thing you can say about Jesus is that he died, was buried, and was raised. That's primary importance. There's other important stuff too, but that's first. And so that probably was, especially that first generation, they might not have felt as much of a need. The further you get from it, the more you might have a need to. Well, there are other stories out there. Mark, why didn't you add what these other people said? So I think we have some of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, to go off of what Mark was saying, this Mark, like I do think it keeps the reader or hearer close to the women, like as sort of vicarious characters, because you're receiving the gospel news as you're hearing this anyway, which I think is what you're trying to say. But because it ends on this sort of this question mark really. But you've also already received the news that they would transmit anyway. Maybe we're just talking about something.
Well, it could be, and the women are certainly going to. The women eventually will transmit this anyway.
The text is doing it already.
The text does it, and we, obviously the women told somebody. Otherwise, how would we know that they went to the tomb and saw an angel who said this? Well, of course, obviously they told somebody, but their first inclination was not to do that because they were fearful.
Yeah, Mark is probably just a brilliant writer and saw it as redundant to say. No better.
Yeah, that could be.
To go and tell somebody or ask more questions.
Well, and there are many discussions about this ending of Mark, and in fact, the early church, somebody sat down and added a couple, what we would call a couple verses, really one blob. It's called the shorter ending, and somebody sat down and put a longer ending together because they weren't satisfied. This left them hanging. So we'll talk about that when we come back after John's Gospel. I don't want to do that now because the longer ending, especially if you have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, The longer ending is basically pieces of Matthew, Mark, and Luke stitched together. I'm sorry, Matthew, Luke, and John's resurrection narrative stitched together. So it's basically an appendix, except for handling snakes, but we'll come back to that. That's kind of the one unique thing in there. Well, let's jump over to Matthew 28 here. Matthew 28. So in Matthew 28, we have a little more than what we got in Mark. Mark, we had 8 verses. Matthew goes 20 verses here. And we actually get away from the empty tomb too. We get up to Galilee at the end. So, all right. So Sabbath, first day of the week was dawning. After the Sabbath, as the first day of the week was dawning, day after the Sabbath, sorry. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. So there are only 2 women in Matthew, both of whom are named Mary. There were 2 Marys in Mark and a Salome. Matthew just narrates Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Mary, Jesus's mother, Mary, somebody else. Okay, we don't know. And suddenly there was a great earthquake. I mentioned this in my Easter sermon. Matthew's the only gospel that had an earthquake at Jesus's crucifixion, and he parallels that with an earthquake at Jesus's resurrection. For an angel of the Lord descending from heaven came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. So how is the tomb opened? An angel did it. Earthquaking angel. And if it's a little mystical or a little mysterious in Mark who this guy is, there's no doubt in Matthew. Angel came, rolled back the stone. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. Is this just a regular kid? No. His appearance is like lightning, his clothing white as snow. So this guy is glowing in some way. This is not your ordinary guy sitting in the tomb. And for fear of him, the guards shook. What guards? Well, Matthew is the only gospel that talks about the priests setting a guard at the tomb. On Saturday, they didn't want anybody to come steal the body, so they went to Pilate, asked Pilate to seal it up and guard it. He said, y'all got troops, do it yourself, go for it. So they did. They sealed the tomb and put a guard there. So now, what happens to the guards? Well, they shook and they became like dead men. Irony, Jesus is alive, the tomb is open, and the guards are fainting like dead men. But then the angel said to the women, do not be afraid. Another good angelic thing. I know you're looking for Jesus who's crucified, very similar to Mark. He is not here, for he has been raised. As he said, come see the place where he lay. Raised as he said, come see the place where he lay. That same kind of pattern here as in Mark. Then go quickly and tell his disciples he's been raised from the dead. And indeed, he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you'll see him, very similar to the Markan proclamation. This is my message for you. So they left the tomb quickly with fear, like they had in Mark, but also great joy, mega joy. They had mega fear, actually, and now they have mega joy. So they left and ran to tell the disciples. And now we get the first narrated appearance of Jesus. Suddenly, Jesus met them and said, greetings. Hey, y'all. Good morning. Greetings. And they came to him, they took hold of his feet and worshiped him. As I mentioned on Easter Sunday, this is something new. The word worship has not been applied to Jesus so far. The disciples did many things, but worshiping Jesus was not one of them. But now, whatever there is about him or the circumstances, not just saying, oh, great to see you. How was your weekend? No, something is different enough that Luke and John will say some more about the nature of Jesus at that point. But something is different enough about his existence now that their response is worship. And in the Jewish world, worship is something that belonged to God alone. So the message of Matthew here is the women are starting to treat Jesus like we treated God previously. And Jesus said to them, don't be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. And I also mentioned this in my Easter sermon. Brothers is such a wonderful word. The disciples fled in Mark and Matthew and Luke and John. The disciples abandoned him, hung him out to dry, had nothing to do with him. Peter even denied knowing who the heck he was. And yet Jesus says, go tell those rat-fink, no good sons of... no, go tell my brothers. My brothers. I'm going to Galilee. Head up there. They'll see me there. Wonderful, wonderful words of assurance from Jesus. So Mark, we just had the empty tomb cluster. Matthew, we've got the empty tomb cluster. Then we also have a Jerusalem appearance. Jesus is in Jerusalem at the tomb. And then we'll also have a Galilean appearance. So Matthew will narrate that in just a minute. So far, so good. But Matthew also narrates something else. And by the way, a reminder, I've talked about this before, but let's mention this because I haven't mentioned it in this context. Of the four Gospels, Matthew is the most Jewish, and the geographic location of Matthew's community is probably the closest of the four Gospels to Jerusalem. Most folks think that Matthew's Christian community that he was part of and writing for was either in northeast Israel or southwest Syria, what we would call southwest Syria. It was somewhere in what we would kind of call the Greater Holy Land. John, Luke, Mark may have been written, in the Roman church. Luke and John, perhaps around Ephesus in Turkey. But Matthew's community seems to be Holy Land, Greater Holy Land, Syria or Israel. And so the fact that they are still closer to Jerusalem than anyone else means they're also closer to higher percentages of Jewish territory. There are Jews scattered all through the Roman Empire, but the concentration, the percentage in the population is higher in Matthew's area than it would be in other parts of the Roman Empire. And so part of what happens in Matthew is there is some rubbing and some friction between the Jewish leaders and the Christian church, apparently. That seems to be implied. John also shows that rubbing. There are some scholars that think John's community was not really in Ephesus, but also was in the Greater Holy Land. I think it might be plausible that John originally was in the Holy Land area, Greater Holy Land area, and then relocated to Ephesus because of some of this persecution. In the book of Acts, the church spreads out of Jerusalem because the persecution is getting so bad. So I don't see that as a non-possibility. But we get this thing that's unique in Matthew here. So Matthew's the only one that's talked about setting the guard, only one that mentions the guard at the tomb. And then he's the only one, and he takes a while to do it. We've got 20 verses about the resurrection, and he uses a quarter of those verses to talk about what the guards say. So apparently, this is something that was a live issue for Matthew and for Matthew's community. Important enough for him to spend a quarter of his resurrection time on this. So he says, while they were going, while the women were going to tell the brothers to go to Galilee, while they were going and doing this, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests everything that had happened. And after the priests had assembled with the elders, they devised a plan to give a large sum of money to the soldiers, telling them, you must say his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this comes to the governor's ears, we'll satisfy him and keep you out of trouble, because it's a potential capital offense for guards to be sleeping on duty. But if there's word of it, we'll smooth it over. So the guards took the money and did as they were directed. And this story is still told among the Jews to this day being 80s. But this story is still out there. This is something you'll still hear in the 21st century. Folks say, oh, yeah, somebody just stole the body. If somebody did steal the body, the easy response is, okay, show it. If there's a body out there, it'd be really easy to stop the Christian movement pretty fast. Produce it, find it, show it, and that's over. But for whatever reason, Matthew thinks this is important enough because that rumor is around his community enough that he takes extra time to narrate this and tell us the derivation of this rumor. All right. So then verse 16, the last quarter of Matthew's resurrection account. So the first half is at the tomb. Third quarter is the guards, and the last quarter is in Galilee. So the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed. And when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. And this is not the same word that John uses about Thomas doubting. That's about not having faith. This word is more, we would probably say equivocating. Is he or isn't he? I'm not, what? Is that really him? It's not I don't believe it. It's a iffiness word. So some doubted. They worshipped, but there was some, is this really true? And maybe the equivocation partially could be, is this really happening? Is this, am I dreaming? Am I having a hallucination? Is this real? Okay, so they worshiped him, but some doubted. But Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, which is where we get our baptismal formula from, Matthew's gospel here, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. So I've been given authority by God. Now I want you to go out and teach all peoples, baptize them, and teach them to obey everything I've commanded you. And then Matthew ends with this statement, and remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. Matthew's gospel, back in the beginning, Jesus was prophesied to be Emmanuel, God with us. That's important to Matthew's theology all the way through his gospel. And Matthew ends with the statement, Jesus is always present with you. Matthew doesn't feel the need to tell us anything about the sending of the Holy Spirit because God's presence through Jesus in Matthew's mind is sufficient to be with his church as they go forward and do his work. To have a separate, specific narration of the giving of the Spirit on Easter night in John or on the 50th day in Luke, Acts, Matthew doesn't feel the need to let us know that because Jesus is Emmanuel. He's promised to be with us, and he'll always be with us. He's promised to always be with us to the end of the age until God comes back. Until I come back, Jesus. That we have God drawing things to a close, I'm with you. So even though you're not seeing me in the same way, my presence is going to be there all the way through until the end of the age. All right, questions or thoughts about that? Yes, Bill.
Where in here does it, you talked about him appearing to the disciples in the room,
right,
where the Last Supper was,
right,
and that's where doubting Thomas had to put his hand in.
Right, right.
None of these mention anything about him appearing to them until they get to Galilee.
Matthew and Mark. Mark has nothing. Matthew has Galilee only. He appears to the women at the tomb, but not to this. So the upper room cluster of the Jerusalem cluster will be Luke, and we'll get that in Luke, and we'll get that in John, which is, and I guess perhaps a longer ending of Mark. But have to go back and look at that sequence again. But yeah, that will be next week. We'll tackle that, but those certainly will be part of that cluster. The Jerusalem cluster will be expanded in Luke and John. It's not just to the women at the tomb, but you forgot to mention, he appeared to. Okay.
Well, when the women left the tomb, they ran back to tell the disciples. Didn't Peter and another disciple go up to the tomb?
And Luke and John both narrate that in slightly different ways, but yes, and we'll get to that next time. But yes, yeah. In John, it's a foot race between Peter and the beloved disciple, and the beloved disciple makes it first. Hint, his testimony is even better than Peter's. Peter's wonderful, but our guy's better. He made it first, but he doesn't go in. And Peter barrel, and we'll get to that with John. But yeah, good question. Good question. So obviously, I talked about putting together these gospel traditions you know, I've used this image before, but think of a box of Christmas ornaments on your tree that the gospel writers are selecting, and they may leave some behind. And you know, you might not be able to get all the ornaments on if your tree is not big enough for all the ornaments you've collected over, 40 years of marriage or whatever, you know, you buy a second tree or, then you might just put some of these up this year and next year. So the gospel writers do pick and choose. But there is this tradition vat, this vat of stories are being passed around orally that they're picking and choosing from. So there's no doubt that all four gospel writers are picking and choosing what they want to make their point. That's very clear. They have a thesis in mind. They have points they're trying to make, and they're picking and choosing to bolster the points they want to make. And so for Matthew, it's not important that we say anything about the upper room if others want to say about that. And Matthew may not have known those particular stories. That may have been in a different bucket of tradition that another part of the church had, or Matthew may have known about it and just ignored it. Said, no, not what I want to use for my gospel. I want to spend time making sure we know that the guards made up the story about falling asleep because they were told to and paid off to do it. They were bribed. So for Matthew, that's important.
It's wild to me that the ascension is only in Luke and Acts. I don't think that'd be important.
Exactly. Yeah, that's we'll get to that too next week. I mean, yeah, we put it on the church calendar every year. It's one of the principal feast days of the church that we never do anything with, but in theory, it's one of the principal feast days of the church. We usually talk about it on the Sunday between Ascension and Pentecost, but all right. Well, we'll stop there. Next week we will do Luke and John and come back to the long ending, but the other endings of Mark as well. So one last week. And then we have the question of what we're thinking of doing next fall. So if you have any brilliant ideas, let me know what you might be interested in.